The vault trembled with the sound of fists on flesh, over and over, though no one outside would ever hear it. Deep beneath the earth, in a bunker sealed away from a world he had never seen, a boy lay bleeding on cold concrete. His name was Piran, though most days his father barely called him that. Today it was just a grunt, an order, a demand to get back up. He got up. He always got up. Blood ran from his nose, dripping onto a floor scarred by years of the same routine. His father stood over him, arms crossed, disappointment carved into every line of his face. This was not punishment. This was training. At least, that was the word his father used. Piran didn't know any other life. He had been born down here, or so he'd been told. Raised on lies dressed up as protection. Somewhere above them, his father said, the world had ended. Fire had swallowed the sky. Monsters walked where cities used to stand. Down here was the only safety left. For 17 years, Piran believed it. Today, something in him finally cracked. Rewind 2 months. It started with a whisper in the dark, and it would end with the ground opening up beneath everything Piran thought he knew. The bunker was small, though it hadn't always felt that way. 3 rooms, a locked steel door, and a father who ruled every inch of it like a warden. Piran's earliest memory was a push-up bar bolted to the wall, and his father's voice counting numbers that never seemed to end. There were no toys down here, no windows, no other children to compare a childhood against, just drills and pain, and the constant reminder that the outside world would kill him the moment he stepped into it unprepared. He grew up strong, absurdly strong, if he'd had anyone to measure himself against. His body could take hits that would shatter normal bone. Wounds closed faster than they should. He never questioned it. His father called it necessary, called it the only reason Piran might survive when the day finally came to leave. But there was a wrongness to it all, a wrongness Piran had felt for years without naming it. His father flinched at odd hours, glancing toward the door like he expected someone. Sometimes, late at night, Piran heard him talking, not to himself, to someone on the other end of an old, cracked phone that shouldn't have had any signal down here at all. Piran never learned who was on the other end. That conversation stayed buried, another locked door in a life full of them. What Piran did learn, on the night everything changed, was smaller and colder than any secret about the outside world. It was about his mother. His father had always said she was dead. Killed before the bunker doors closed, one of the first casualties when everything above ground fell apart. Piran had grown up mourning a woman he couldn't remember, her face nothing but a story his father told to explain an empty second bed. Then the power cut out. It happened without warning. The lights flickered, dimmed, and died, plunging the bunker into a darkness so complete that Piran could hear his own heartbeat. His father swore, fumbling for the emergency lantern, and in that gap of chaos, Piran saw something he was never supposed to see. A drawer, usually locked, hanging open, papers spilling loose, and a photograph, half buried, of a woman smiling next to a boy who could only have been Piran, years younger, in a place that was clearly not underground. Sunlight, grass, a sky the color of something alive. The world outside was not supposed to exist. Not like that. Not warm and green and safe. Piran's hands shook as he held the photograph. Somewhere above his head, his whole life had been a lie wrapped around a single brutal purpose. Keep him here, keep him trained, keep him believing there was nowhere else to go. He didn't confront his father that night. He waited, the photograph hidden against his chest, rage and grief tangled together in a way he had no name for. When the lantern light finally caught his face, his father saw something different in his son's eyes, something he didn't like. The beating that followed was worse than any training session before it. Piran took it. He always took it, but this time, underneath the pain, something else was building, a decision. Days passed in silence between them, tension coiled tight enough to snap. Piran began watching the routines his father kept, the patterns of when the old man slept, when he checked the cameras, when the halls sat empty. He was done believing in monsters he'd never seen. He wanted the truth, even if it killed him to find it. His chance came sooner than expected, and it came wrong. He tried to steal the keys. A simple plan, born out of desperation more than skill. His father was faster, always faster. Piran barely got his hand on the ring before he was slammed into the wall, keys wrenched away, a fist driving into his ribs hard enough to fold him in half. "Get up," his father said. "You're not ready. You'll never be ready if you can't even take a man half asleep." Piran got up. He spat blood onto the floor and looked his father dead in the eye, and for the first time, he didn't look away first. That defiance cost him, but it also planted something. His father saw it too, a shift in the boy he thought he'd fully broken, and maybe that was what frightened him more than any monster on the surface ever could. Then, without warning, the doors unlocked. It wasn't Piran's doing. It wasn't his father's either. Judging by the look of pure shock on the old man's face when the heavy steel groaned open on its own, hydraulics hissing, a command sent from somewhere neither of them controlled. Red emergency lights swept the halls. An alarm Piran had never heard before wailed through the bunker like a warning meant for someone else entirely. His father froze for only a second. Then he grabbed Piran by the arm and started running, not away from the open door, but toward it. Piran didn't understand. After years of being told the surface was death, his father was now dragging him straight into it, muttering under his breath about time running out, about needing to move before something worse arrived. Whatever secret his father had been guarding, it wasn't just about protecting Piran from an apocalypse. It was about keeping him from something specific, someone specific. They burst out into open air, and Piran stopped breathing for a moment that felt endless. Sunlight touched his skin for the first time in his memory. Real sunlight, not the pale fluorescent glow of the bunker. Wind moved against his face. In the distance, buildings stood tall and quiet, and above him stretched a sky so wide it made his knees weak. No fire, no ruin. Just a soft, ordinary afternoon, the kind of thing his father had sworn didn't exist anymore. For exactly one heartbeat, 17 years of lies collapsed into pure, aching betrayal. Then the sky tore open. A dark sphere bled into existence above the horizon, swelling behind the sun like a second, dying planet. Piran barely had time to register the wrongness of it before the light dimmed, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the street. A low sound rolled through the air, something between a groan and a scream, and the world he had just discovered was safe revealed itself to be anything but. Monsters poured from the widening dark, shapes with too many limbs, skin like wet stone, mouths that split wrong. People screamed and scattered. Cars overturned. The peaceful afternoon Piran had waited his entire life to see lasted less than 60 seconds before it dissolved into chaos. His father's grip tightened, hauling him across a bridge already beginning to buckle under the panic of fleeing crowds. Piran's legs, trained for years to endure exactly this kind of strain, carried him forward on instinct even as his mind reeled. Halfway across, with the bridge groaning and cracking beneath them, his father shoved something into his hands. A pendant, cold metal, worn smooth from years of touch, and a note, hastily scrawled, words Piran wouldn't read until later, when the blood on his hands had dried and the screaming had finally stopped. "Your mother is alive." Then his father let go. Piran turned, reaching for him, but the crowd surged between them, a wave of terrified bodies and collapsing concrete. When he looked again, his father was gone, swallowed by the chaos, leaving Piran alone, on a crumbling bridge with a fabricated apocalypse turned suddenly, horribly real. He survived that first hour on instinct alone. A broken metal pole became a weapon. Years of drills he'd resented became the only reason he was still breathing when the sun finally set on a city he barely recognized as belonging to the same species he did. 4 days passed after that. 4 days of scavenging, hiding, learning the new shape of a world gone wrong. Piran moved carefully, quietly, the way his father had drilled into him 1,000 times. Except now there was no one counting his push-ups, no one waiting to strike him down if he faltered. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a pit with no bottom in sight. It was hunger that finally led him to her. He smelled bread before he saw the girl holding it. She was crouched behind the husk of a burned-out car, sharing a piece with someone smaller, some kind of shelter cat curled at her feet. When she spotted Piran watching from the shadows, gaunt, filthy, clothes hanging off a body that had clearly been through hell, she didn't scream. She didn't run either. She just broke the bread in half and held a piece out to him. Her name was Haru. A former track star, she told him later, back before running had become something you did to survive instead of something you did for medals. A pale scar traced along one side of her face, a mark from a childhood she didn't explain that first day, and Piran didn't ask about. There was a steadiness to her that pulled at something in him, something starved for more than food. He took the bread. It was the first kindness anyone had ever shown him without expecting pain in return. Haru studied him as he ate, taking in the way his hands shook, the way his eyes kept flicking toward every shadow like a threat could come from anywhere. She'd seen plenty of desperate survivors since the sky tore open. None of them looked quite like him. "Where are your people?" she asked. Piran didn't have an answer that made sense out loud, so he said nothing, and Haru, to her credit, didn't push. She led him instead. Through streets littered with wreckage, down into the mouth of an old subway station that had been converted into something between a shelter and a fortress. Dozens of survivors moved through the tunnels below, some standing guard, some tending small fires, all of them carrying the same hollow-eyed exhaustion Piran now recognized in his own reflection. A man named Bom Huang ran the place, or ran it as much as anyone could run a community held together by fear and desperation. He'd been a doctor once, before the world ended, treating people instead of the wounded strays and desperate survivors that now filled his makeshift clinic. He looked Piran over with the same critical eye he gave every new arrival, checking for bites, for infection, for the kind of desperation that turned people dangerous. What he found instead surprised him. Piran's wounds, deep enough to warrant real concern, were already knitting closed at a pace that made no medical sense at all. Bom didn't say anything about it. Not yet. He simply gestured for Piran to sit, and for the first time in days, Piran let himself stop moving. The shelter gave him something he hadn't expected. Not comfort exactly. The tunnels were cold and cramped and smelled of unwashed bodies and old fear, but something close to belonging. A woman who used to design clothes before the collapse took one look at his tattered bunker uniform and set to work stitching him something that actually fit, muttering under her breath about proportions and fabric scraps like the apocalypse hadn't touched her craft at all. A loud, cynical girl with dyed red hair mocked his awkward manners within the first hour, though there was no real malice in it, just the rough affection of people who'd learned that gentleness could get you killed if you weren't careful who you showed it to. Piran didn't know how to exist among people. His father had made sure of that, but something about the shelter's chaos, its fragile, stubborn community, made the not knowing feel survivable. It didn't last. 3 days after Piran arrived, a new group descended into the tunnels, and they weren't looking for shelter. They were looking to take one. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man with a scar-crossed jaw and eyes that cataloged every weapon, every weakness, every person worth exploiting in the room within seconds of walking in. Behind him came a dozen armed men who moved like they'd done this before. Other shelters, other tunnels, other terrified crowds forced to hand over what little safety they'd managed to build. Bom tried to negotiate. The captain wasn't interested in negotiating. Within minutes, the shelter's precious stockpile of food and medicine had new owners, and the survivors who'd called this place home found themselves treated as something closer to livestock than people. Piran watched it happen with his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Every instinct his father had beaten into him screamed to act, to fight, to end the threat before it could root itself deeper. But he was one man among strangers, in a world he barely understood, and Haru's hand on his arm was the only thing keeping him rooted in place. "Not yet," she murmured. "Not like this." He listened. It cost him more than he expected to hold still. The cost came due 2 days later, when one of the captain's men, drunk on stolen liquor and the small, ugly power of holding a gun in a place where no one could stop him, grabbed Piran's family photo off a shelf where it had been carelessly tossed among looted valuables. He waved it around, laughing, asking who the ugly kid in the picture was, oblivious to the fact that the ugly kid was standing 3 feet away with his hands curling slowly into fists. That might have ended in nothing more than wounded pride. It didn't stay that way. Across the room, a young shelter girl, barely more than a teenager, had been quietly setting aside scraps of food for Piran ever since his first night, a small kindness she never explained and he never questioned. When the same drunk thug turned his attention toward Bom, dragging the doctor by the collar with some vague threat about needing him for something worse than medicine, the girl stepped between them. She told the man to leave Bom alone. He didn't like being told anything. The knife was fast, faster than anyone expected from someone so deep in drink, and it found the girl's stomach before a single person in that tunnel could move to stop it. She crumpled without a sound, blood pooling dark against the concrete floor, and for a moment, the entire shelter simply stopped, frozen by a violence that had crossed some line even the previous days of theft hadn't reached. Piran didn't remember crossing the room. One moment he stood near the wall, the next his hand had closed around the thug's wrist hard enough to hear bone grind. the knife wrenched free and buried in the man's shoulder before he could so much as scream properly. Piran's other hand found his throat, pressing him back against the concrete pillar, and for a single, terrible second, every ounce of restraint he'd been taught to abandon in the bunker rose up screaming to finish it. It was Baum's voice that stopped him. Not pleading exactly, just steady, insistent, reminding Piran that killing this man here, now, would only bring the rest of the captain's crew down on all of them at once. Piran let go. The thug slid to the floor, gasping, alive but broken in ways that would take him a long time to forget. It wasn't enough. Nothing would have been enough. The girl was already gone by the time Baum reached her, her small kindness paid for in a currency no one in that tunnel would ever get back. Grief moved through the shelter differently than fear did. Fear made people small, made them hide. Grief made the air heavier, made the silence afterward feel like something with weight and teeth. Piran sat beside her body long after the others had gone back to their fires, turning that borrowed bread from days ago over in his memory, the first kindness he'd ever known, mirrored now in the last one this girl would ever give. He didn't cry. He wasn't sure he still knew how, but something in him hardened that night, a resolve that hadn't fully existed before. This world took people who did the right thing and erased them without ceremony. If he was going to survive it, he needed to be strong enough that it couldn't do the same to the people he'd started, however reluctantly, however impossibly, to care about. The captain's reckoning came sooner than anyone in the shelter expected, and from a direction nobody could have predicted. Whatever it was that had let the captain and his men rule the surface with such casual brutality, it turned out to have a price. Late that same night, as the shelter settled into an uneasy quiet, a sound tore through the tunnels that had nothing human left in it at all. The captain's own body began to change, flesh splitting and reforming in ways that defied every rule Piran thought he understood. A parasite buried inside him finally taking hold and turning its host into something with claws and hunger and no memory of mercy. It didn't discriminate between its own men and the survivors it had come to rob. By the time the screaming started, half the tunnel had already dissolved into panic, bodies scattering in every direction as the thing that used to be a man began tearing through anyone too slow to run. Piran moved before he had time to think it through. His body, trained for exactly this kind of chaos even if his mind had never been prepared for the reality of it, carried him straight into the fight while everyone else fled away from it. The transformed captain was fast, stronger than anything human should be, and Piran took hits that would have killed most of the survivors standing frozen behind him. But there was something in the creature's chest, a faint pulse of light visible only if you knew to look for it, and some instinct buried deep in Piran's blood recognized it instantly for what it was, a core, a weak point, the single thing holding this monster's regeneration together. He didn't understand how he knew. He simply acted on it, driving his fist through torn flesh and shattered bone until his knuckles closed around something warm and pulsing and impossibly fragile. It came apart in his hand, like it had never been solid at all. The captain's body collapsed, monstrous mass dissolving back into something almost human, almost still, forever. Silence followed, broken only by ragged breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere deep in the tunnels. Piran stood over the body, blood on his hands that wasn't entirely his own, and became aware, slowly, of dozens of eyes watching him from the shadows. They'd seen what he could do now. There was no taking that back. Architected narrative progressions spanning crisis, revelation, and discovery. Architected narrative progressions spanning crisis, revelation, and discovery. The tunnels never felt safe again after that night, but they felt different. Survivors who had flinched away from Piran now watched him with something closer to wary respect. He didn't try to explain what he was. He didn't have an explanation to give. Baum found him afterward, sitting apart from the others, hands still stained despite the water he'd used to scrub them clean. The doctor didn't ask about the core, or the healing, or the strength that shouldn't have belonged to any ordinary survivor. He simply sat beside him and said the shelter needed people like him now, more than it needed answers. Piran took that as permission to stay. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm he slowly learned to trust. Patrols, rationing, small repairs to the barricades sealing the tunnel mouths against whatever wandered too close after dark. Haru worked beside him more often than not, teaching him the shelter's unspoken rules the way she'd once taught new runners the shape of a race. Chicken Comb, a broad-shouldered enforcer with a mohawk he refused to let anyone mock more than once, took a particular interest in Piran, needling him with rough jokes that always seemed to end in genuine concern buried under the sarcasm. Then the tunnels themselves stopped being safe. It started with a scratching sound, faint at first, easy to mistake for settling concrete. By the time the barricade at the north entrance buckled inward, there was no mistaking what was coming through. 3 of them, then 5. Creatures with too many joints in their limbs, moving in bursts that made them hard to track, mouths lined with teeth that seemed designed for tearing through more than just flesh. The shelter's makeshift defenses, spears and scavenged rifles, barely slowed them down. Piran didn't wait for someone to give an order. He'd learned enough now to trust the strange, instinctive pull in his vision, the way certain points on a monster's body seemed to glow faintly if he looked at them the right way. A soft light no one else in the tunnel could apparently see. He crushed the first core with his bare hand before the creature attached to it finished registering he was there. The second took longer, a grappling, brutal fight that left gashes down his side he didn't have time to feel yet. Haru covered his blind spot with a spear, driving it into a joint to buy him half a second, and that half second was enough. By the time the last creature dissolved into stillness, the tunnel reeked of blood and scorched air, and Piran was on his knees, breathing hard, every part of him screaming from the effort. But the shelter stood. Nobody behind him had died. That counted for something. It had to. Baum patched the worst of his wounds in silence, glancing at the speed with which the smaller cuts were already closing over. Whatever Piran was, it was becoming harder to pretend the shelter hadn't noticed. Supplies ran thin after the breach. Food stores meant to last another month had been picked through by the captain's crew before his death, and what remained wouldn't stretch far enough to matter. Baum called it plainly, standing in front of the gathered survivors with the tired honesty of a man who'd run out of easier answers. Someone needed to go back to the surface. Someone needed to bring back food and medicine, or the shelter would starve long before any monster reached them. Piran volunteered before anyone else could speak. Haru volunteered right behind him, ignoring the look he gave her, the one that said he'd rather she stayed somewhere safer. She reminded him, flatly, that safety wasn't a place that existed anymore, not down here, not anywhere. If he was going up, she was going with him. 4 others joined the run. A quiet, steady woman named Jijian, who carried herself like she'd been a soldier once. A wiry teenager who never seemed to stop moving even when standing still. And Eugene, a broad, eager young man whose kindness ran a half step ahead of his caution, always the first to offer help and the last to think through the cost of offering it. Piran spent the walk up teaching them what he'd learned, how to move quietly enough that the creature's hearing, sharper than sight in most of them, wouldn't catch a footstep from 3 streets over, how a thrown rock could pull a monster's attention away from a hiding survivor, how the core's faint light, invisible to them but obvious to him, marked the one spot worth aiming for if a fight became unavoidable. They listened. Eugene listened hardest of all, asking questions the others were too tired or too frightened to bother with. There was an earnestness to him that reminded Piran, distantly and painfully, of the bread Haru had once broken in half for a stranger. The supply run started well enough. An abandoned pharmacy yielded bandages and antibiotics. A collapsed grocery store, picked over by looters but not entirely emptied, gave them enough canned food to justify the risk. Piran began to let himself believe they might make it back without losing anyone. Then Eugene heard the crying. It came from an alley 2 streets off their planned route, faint and broken, the sound of someone hurt and terrified and very much still alive. Piran told him to ignore it. The plan was the plan, and deviating from it, however good the reason, was how people died out here. Eugene didn't listen. He was gone before Piran finished the sentence, sprinting toward the sound with the same reckless certainty that had made him volunteer for this run in the first place. Jian went after him, cursing under her breath, unwilling to let him die alone even if his choice had been foolish. Piran followed. He didn't have another option. The alley held an injured stranger, an older man with a shattered leg, pinned beneath fallen scaffolding and utterly unable to move. Eugene had already started clearing debris when Piran arrived, working with a desperate energy that ignored every warning about noise, about time, about the fact that every second spent here was a second the monsters had to find them. They heard it before they saw it. A deep, guttural sound rolling down the alley like a wave, followed by a shape too large to have moved so quietly. The creature was red, skin like raw muscle stretched over a frame built for tearing through concrete as easily as flesh, and it had heard every bit of the noise Eugene's rescue had made. Piran shouted for them to run. Jijian grabbed the injured stranger's good arm, half dragging him. Eugene hesitated one beat too long, checking to make sure the old man wasn't left behind, and that hesitation was the difference between escape and disaster. The monster's arm came down like a falling wall. Piran didn't see the exact moment it happened. He heard it, the sound impossible to mistake for anything else, and turned in time to see the last few seconds of a man who had tried, right up until the end, to do the right thing for a total stranger. Jijian didn't make it either, caught in the same brutal sweep, her final act a scream meant to warn the others rather than save herself. Grief would have to wait. The creature was already turning toward the rest of them, and behind it, drawn by the noise, more shapes were beginning to gather at the mouth of the alley. Haru grabbed a can of petrol from an abandoned car, hands shaking as she splashed it across the alley floor and struck a spark from a lighter Bomb had given her for emergencies exactly like this one. Fire roared up between them and the horde, buying seconds that felt agonizingly short. It wasn't enough to stop the red monster. It was already through the flames, skin blistering and healing in the same breath, bearing down on Piran with a speed that left no room for the careful, calculated fighting he'd used in the tunnels. Something inside him broke loose. He felt it before he understood it, a heat building behind his ribs, crawling down through his arms and gathering at his fingertips like static before a storm. Blue light flickered across his knuckles, faint at first, then brighter, crackling with something that felt less like fire and more like lightning given shape. He didn't have a name for it yet. He didn't need one. When his fist connected with the monster's side, the blue light exploded outward on impact, tearing through flesh with a force his ordinary strength alone could never have managed. The creature staggered, shrieking, and Piran drove the same burning fist toward the faint glow of its core before it could recover. It came apart in a spray of blue-white sparks. Piran dropped to one knee immediately after, the sudden absence of that heat leaving him hollowed out and shaking. Blood dripped from his nose, thin and dark, and his vision swam at the edges like the world itself had gone thin. Whatever he'd just done had cost him something he didn't yet know how to measure. Haru reached him first, pulling him upright, her voice tight with a fear that had nothing to do with the monsters still circling beyond the dying fire. He told her he was fine. She didn't believe him, and honestly, neither did he. They made it back to the shelter's outer perimeter as the fire died and the last of the horde lost interest in the smoke. The teenager who'd survived the run walked in silence the whole way, shock written plain across a face too young for what he'd just witnessed. The rescued stranger wept quietly, alive because of a sacrifice he would carry the weight of for however long he had left. The shelter's reaction to their return was subdued. Food and medicine welcomed, but the empty spaces where Eugene and Jian should have stood, impossible to ignore. Bomb said nothing about the losses out loud, but the tightness around his eyes said enough. Piran sat apart from the others that night, turning the blue light he'd summoned over in his mind, trying to understand a power that had appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as fast, leaving him drained in its wake. Haru found him there, settling down beside him without asking permission. The way she'd apparently decided was simply how things worked between them now. She talked, eventually, about the scar along her face. A knife, she said quietly, from years before the sky ever tore open, a moment of violence from an ordinary, forgotten kind of world. She hadn't told anyone the full story in a long time. She wasn't entirely sure why she was telling him now, except that something about surviving today made old wounds feel worth naming out loud. Piran listened without interrupting. When she finished, he admitted, quietly, that he pushed himself as hard as he did partly because he was afraid of what would happen to people like her if he didn't. It wasn't a confession he'd planned to make. It slipped out anyway, honest in a way his life had rarely allowed him to be. Neither of them said much after that. They didn't need to. 3 days later, a radio buried in the shelter's supply room crackled to life for the first time since the world ended. The voice on the other end belonged to a man who called himself List. He spoke calmly, deliberately, giving coordinates and instructions to anyone still alive within range of the signal. At midnight, he said, every survivor who could hear him should shine a light toward the sky for exactly 10 seconds. Not as a signal to monsters, he assured them, but as a way for isolated pockets of humanity to finally see how many of them remained. The shelter argued about it for hours. Some called it reckless, a beacon for exactly the kind of creatures they'd spent weeks avoiding. Others, worn thin by isolation, argued that knowing they weren't entirely alone was worth almost any risk. At midnight, Piran climbed to the surface with a flashlight in hand and pointed it toward a sky still scarred by that impossible dark sphere. Around him, one by one, other lights blinked on across the ruined skyline, distant and scattered, but undeniably present. Proof that somewhere out there, more people had survived than any of them had dared to hope. List's broadcast mentioned something else before it cut out. A weapon, he claimed, capable of killing the monsters instantly, something worth risking everything to reach. Piran looked at that scattered constellation of flashlights for a long moment, thinking of his mother's note still folded against his chest, thinking of the father who had vanished into a collapsing bridge with an apology he'd never actually spoken aloud. Whatever waited at the source of that signal, he decided, standing there, it was worth walking toward. Orchestrated narrative continuation through organic story development. Orchestrated narrative continuation through organic story development. 3 days after the flashlights lit the sky, Piran set out toward the source of List's broadcast, and this time the group traveling with him was smaller and more deliberate than the supply run had been. Haru refused to be left behind again, and Chickencomb insisted on coming along with a bluntness that left no room for argument, muttering something about not letting the two of them wander off and get themselves killed without backup. Bomb stayed at the shelter. Someone had to hold the tunnels together while the rest of them chased a signal that might lead nowhere. The coordinates List had given put the source somewhere deep in the eastern half of the ruined city, a stretch of territory none of them had explored yet. Within the first few hours, it became clear why. The streets here bore markings, crude symbols painted in fading red across broken storefronts and overturned cars, boundary lines drawn by someone who considered this ground their own. Piran recognized the pattern from stories traded around the shelter's fires. Looter territory. 3 zones, carved up by rival factions who preyed on survivors with as much hunger as any monster crawling out of the dark sphere's shadow. Zone 1 belonged to a woman the survivors called the Predator, a name spoken in the tunnels with the kind of dread usually reserved for the creatures themselves. They moved carefully, sticking to alleys and collapsed buildings, avoiding open ground wherever the terrain allowed it. It was Chickencomb who spotted the first sign of another survivor watching them from a rooftop 2 streets over, a lone figure who vanished the moment he was noticed. They found him an hour later, or rather, he found them, stepping out from behind a burned delivery truck with his hands raised in a gesture that was somehow both surrender and warning at once. His name was Jin Gu, though he introduced himself simply as Jin, a thin, sharp-eyed young man whose calm in the middle of hostile territory unsettled Piran more than any monster had. He claimed to know these streets better than anyone still breathing, and he offered to guide them toward List's broadcast source in exchange for something he wouldn't specify yet. Haru's instincts flagged him immediately as trouble. Piran wasn't sure trouble was the wrong read, but something about the way Jin spoke, calculating each word before it left his mouth, suggested a man who thought several moves ahead of everyone around him. That kind of mind could be dangerous. It could also be useful. Jin led them toward a collapsed parking structure he called a safe house, though safe felt like a generous word for a place with more escape routes than walls. Inside, huddled against a support pillar, was a girl who could only have been his sister, her skin mottled with dark veins that hadn't been natural even before the world ended. The parasite, Jin explained flatly, had gotten into her 3 weeks ago, a monster's bite that didn't kill outright, but changed instead, slow and irreversible, turning its host into something less and less human with each passing day. He'd kept her hidden, kept her fed, kept pretending there might be a cure somewhere out in the ruins worth searching for. There wasn't. He'd known that for over a week. Piran watched the girl's labored breathing, the way her fingers had already begun to curl into something not quite hands anymore, and understood without being told what Jin was about to do. Haru reached for his arm, a silent question about whether they should intervene, whether there was some other option worth trying. There wasn't. Not one that would spare her from what was coming. Jin knelt beside his sister and spoke to her quietly, too low for the others to catch the words. Whatever he said, her expression eased. Some fragile piece of the person she used to be surfacing one last time before the knife in his hand did what mercy required. He didn't cry afterward. He simply stood, wiped the blade clean, and told them he was ready to move. Piran didn't know what to say to a grief carried that silently. He settled for saying nothing at all, falling into step beside a man who had just done something unbearable, and folded it away like a task completed, rather than a wound inflicted. Jin's guidance proved its worth almost immediately. He knew which streets the predator's scouts favored, which rooftops offered clean sightlines, which patterns of movement would read as threatening to a faction always looking for an excuse to strike first. Under his direction, they slipped through the outer edge of Zone 1 without triggering a single alarm. It was Jin, too, who first mentioned the ability that made him valuable beyond simple local knowledge. He could see outcomes before they happened, he said, brief flickers of possibility branching out from any given moment. Enough to know which path led to an ambush, and which led somewhere survivable. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to perfect. But it had kept him and his sister alive longer than most. Piran asked, carefully, why someone with that kind of gift hadn't simply run further from the predator's territory instead of staying close enough to need it constantly. Jin's answer was quiet, and colder than Piran expected. Running required somewhere better to run to. He hadn't found one yet. They pressed deeper into Zone 1 as the afternoon wore thin, the ruined cityscape around them growing steadily more claustrophobic, checkpoints and barricades multiplying with each block. The predator's presence became less a rumor and more a tangible weight in the air, evident in the caged, hollow-eyed survivors Piran glimpsed through gaps in makeshift fences. People kept and traded like livestock rather than treated as anything human. Anger simmered under Piran's ribs at the sight, sharp and familiar, an echo of every year spent under his father's fists. He recognized cruelty when he saw it, even dressed up in different clothes. Jin noticed the tension in his jaw and warned him, without much sympathy in his tone, that anger here would get all of them killed. The predator didn't lose control. She used it, deliberately, as a weapon against anyone reckless enough to let their fury outrun their sense. Piran forced the anger back down. It didn't disappear. It simply waited. Night fell before they reached the heart of Zone 1, and Jin insisted they rest in a defensible position rather than push forward blind. Chicken Comb took first watch, perched atop a half-collapsed wall with a scavenged rifle across his knees, while the others tried to steal what sleep they could in the cold. Piran couldn't sleep. He sat instead with his back against a slab of broken concrete, turning his mother's note over in his fingers by the dim light of a shielded lantern. "Your mother is alive." 4 words that had reshaped everything he thought he understood about his own life, and still no closer to an explanation of where she might actually be. Haru settled beside him without asking, the way she seemed to do more and more often now. She didn't press him to talk. She simply sat close enough that the cold felt slightly less absolute, and after a while, that was enough for both of them. They reached the edge of the predator's stronghold the following morning, a converted stadium ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers built from scavenged scaffolding. Jin stopped them well short of the perimeter, studying the guard rotations with an intensity that suggested he was running a dozen futures through his mind at once, searching for the safest thread through them. Whatever he saw in those flickers of possibility, his expression didn't offer much comfort. He told them, finally, that there was no clean way through. Zone 1's stronghold was too well guarded to slip past unnoticed, and the broadcast source, based on everything he'd gathered from scattered signals over the past weeks, sat somewhere beyond Zones 2 and 3 entirely. Getting there meant going through the predator's territory, one way or another. Piran asked what their odds looked like, doing it her way instead of trying to sneak around. Jin's answer came slower than his usual clipped certainty, and something in his hesitation made Haru's hand drift instinctively toward the knife at her belt. Before he could finish explaining, the decision was taken out of their hands entirely. A horn sounded from one of the watchtowers, sharp and deliberate, and within moments a dozen armed figures emerged from concealed positions around them, weapons raised, escape routes cut off with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. At the center of them stood a woman Piran didn't need an introduction to recognize, tall, coldly composed, a faint crackle of blue energy visible along one gloved hand as she studied the 4 intruders caught in her territory like specimens rather than threats. The predator smiled, slow and unhurried, and told them they'd chosen an interesting day to trespass. Piran's hand curled into a fist at his side, that familiar heat gathering behind his ribs, ready to answer violence with violence, the only way he'd ever been taught to. It was Jin who moved first, and not in the direction Piran expected. He stepped forward, hands raised in an easy, practiced gesture of surrender, and told the predator he had something worth trading. Information about a growing threat gathering strength somewhere in Zone 2, and 2 live specimens interesting enough that she wouldn't want to simply have them killed on sight. Piran's stomach dropped as he understood. A half-second too late, exactly what Jin was doing. The betrayal landed with a coldness that stole the breath from his lungs faster than any physical blow ever had. Jin didn't look back as armed men closed in around Piran and Haru, didn't offer so much as a flicker of apology in his expression. He simply told the predator, flatly, that the boy was a disappointment anyway, all wasted strength and no discipline worth cultivating. Haru's eyes found Piran's, furious and disbelieving, as rough hands forced them both to their knees. Whatever Jin's true intentions were, buried beneath that cold, calculated performance, Piran had no way of guessing them now. All he knew, kneeling in the dirt with the predator's cruel, satisfied gaze fixed on him, was that the man who'd guided them this far had just handed them both over without a flicker of hesitation. Resolved to perpetuate narrative momentum. Resolved to perpetuate narrative momentum. They were dragged into the stadium's underbelly, a maze of concrete corridors lit by scavenged floodlights, past cages holding survivors too broken or too resigned to fight back. Piran counted the faces as they passed, filing away every detail out of old habit, the same way his father had once drilled him to note every exit in a room before sitting down. The predator's interrogation room had once been a locker room. Metal benches lined the walls, and a single chair sat bolted to the floor at the center, stained in ways Piran chose not to examine too closely. They separated him from Haru before the questions started. He fought that harder than anything else, but 4 men with rifles made the argument for him better than words could have. The predator circled him slowly once he was secured to the chair, studying him the way a buyer studies livestock before settling on a price. She asked, almost conversationally, where his people were hiding, how many, what resources they held, whether the strange light she'd heard whispers of, the blue crackle rumored to have torn through a horde of monsters 2 weeks ago, belonged to him. Piran said nothing. She didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded to one of her men, who produced a pair of pliers with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The first finger broke with a sound Piran would remember long after the pain itself had faded into something more bearable. He didn't scream. He'd learned, over 17 years of his father's fists, exactly how to fold pain down into something smaller, something survivable, something that didn't need to leave his throat at all. The predator seemed almost disappointed by his silence. She leaned in close, told him quietly that everyone broke eventually, that the only question was how many pieces of himself he'd sacrifice proving her wrong. He thought of Haru, somewhere in this same building, and said nothing. The second finger broke, then the third. Piran's vision swam, sweat and blood mixing on his skin, and still he gave her nothing, not the shelter's location, not Baum's name, not a single detail that might lead her back to the people who'd shown him the only kindness he'd ever known. Eventually, frustration flickering across her composed features for the first time, the predator called a halt to it, not out of mercy. Simply, she said, because a broken tool told her nothing useful, and she had other uses for him yet. They marched him out to a canyon at the territory's edge sometime near dusk, Haru already there, bound and bruised but alive, relief and fury warring across her face when she saw the state of his hands. Jin stood near the predator's side, expression unreadable, and Piran found he couldn't look at him without a fresh wave of anger threatening to boil over. The canyon itself was a natural ravine, steep walls dropping into darkness on either side, a narrow rope bridge the only way across. The predator's men herded them toward the center of it, weapons raised, clearly intending to make an example of the trespassers who dared to cross into her territory uninvited. She spoke to the gathered crowd of her own people, voice carrying easily across the ravine, promising them this was how she dealt with anyone foolish enough to challenge what she'd built. Piran barely listened. His attention was fixed on Jin, standing quiet and still at the edge of the group, hands folded in a way that looked almost casual. Then Jin's fingers moved. It was subtle, easy to miss if Piran hadn't spent years learning to read the smallest tells in another person's body language, a survival skill his father had beaten into him without ever intending it as a kindness. A sequence of small gestures, deliberate, aimed directly at Haru. Her eyes widened slightly. She understood something Piran didn't yet. A heartbeat later, the cuffs binding Piran's wrists gave way, Haru's fingers having worked the mechanism loose, while everyone's attention stayed fixed on the predator's speech. Piran barely had time to register his hands were free before the world exploded. Charges Jin had planted hours earlier, buried along the canyon's rim during whatever reconnaissance he'd claimed to be doing, detonated in a ring around the predator's gathered forces. Fire and rock erupted skyward, the rope bridge snapping loose from its moorings, chaos tearing through the crowd that had come to watch an execution. The betrayal, it turned out, had been aimed at the predator all along. Jin's cold performance in Zone 1's checkpoint hadn't been abandonment. It had been the only way to get close enough to plant the trap that might actually work. Piran didn't have time to process the relief of that realization. The explosions had done more than scatter the predator's forces. They'd drawn every monster within earshot toward the noise and the fire, and the canyon was rapidly filling with shapes better suited to this chaos than any of them were. The predator, however, remained entirely composed amid the destruction, blue light crackling to life along both her arms as she turned her full attention toward Piran. She'd been hiding her own version of his power the entire time, he realized. Whatever the source of it, however she'd acquired it, the predator moved with a speed and precision that made his own untrained bursts of strength look clumsy by comparison. Piran barely got his arms up in time to block the first strike. It didn't matter. The energy wrapped around her blade sliced through flesh and bone alike with a sound that didn't seem to belong in the world at all, and Piran's left arm separated at the shoulder before his mind fully registered the blow had landed. Pain arrived a half-second later, a white-hot wave that dropped him to his knees in the dirt. Blood poured from the wound in a way that should have killed him within minutes. Haru's scream reached him from somewhere distant, muffled beneath the roaring in his own ears. Something in him refused to simply die there. A pressure built beneath the agony, deep and primal, a sensation entirely separate from the careful, controlled heat he'd learned to summon at his fingertips over the past weeks. This was older, hungrier. It didn't ask permission before it surged forward. The stump where his arm had been split apart with a wet, tearing sound, and where flesh should have simply scarred over, something else grew instead. Dark, chitinous plating spread across new muscle, fingers lengthening into something closer to claws than hands, the transformation moving faster than any wound had ever healed before. Piran's vision narrowed to red. Thought scattered, replaced by something closer to instinct. A hunger that recognized only threat and prey, and nothing in between. The predator, who had underestimated exactly how far this fight could go, took a step back for the first time since the confrontation began. He moved before she could recover her footing, the new claw tearing through her guard with a strength that dwarfed anything he'd managed before. She fought back, blue energy flaring in short, desperate bursts, but the creature Piran had become didn't register pain the way he had moments earlier. It simply kept coming. The end, when it arrived, was fast and brutal, and Piran's fractured awareness registered it only as a distant, satisfying release of pressure. He didn't stop there. Jin came next, thrown backward hard enough to crack against a boulder, saved only by a desperate roll that put distance between himself and the claws now reaching for him. Piran's mind, what remained of it beneath the monster's hunger, screamed a warning even he couldn't fully hear anymore. It was Haru who finally reached him, ducking past a swipe that would have opened her throat, wrapping her arms around a neck that no longer felt entirely human. He grabbed her instead, claws closing around her throat with the same indifferent hunger he'd turned on everyone else. Her voice, when it came, was strained but steady, saying his name the way she had that first day over shared bread, patient and unafraid even as her air ran short. Something in that sound reached past the transformation, a single thread connecting the monster back to the boy underneath it. Her fist connected with his jaw a moment later, thrown with everything she had left, and the impact was enough. The claws loosened. The red haze bled slowly out of Piran's vision, replaced by exhaustion so complete it felt like drowning. He looked down and saw Haru gasping in his remaining arm, bruises already forming where his grip had been, and the horror of what he'd almost done crashed over him harder than any physical wound the predator had inflicted. The new claw remained, dark and monstrous where his arm used to be, a permanent reminder of what lived beneath his skin now. Piran collapsed. Before he could say anything at all, the last thing he registered being Haru's arms catching him on the way down, her voice repeating his name like an anchor thrown to something still drowning. Strategized narrative expansion toward completion milestone. Strategized narrative expansion toward completion milestone. Piran woke to the smell of smoke and the low murmur of voices arguing somewhere close by. His body ached in ways that went beyond ordinary pain, a deep, bone-level exhaustion that made even opening his eyes feel like an effort. The claw was still there. He stared at it for a long moment before the memory of the canyon came flooding back. The predator's blade, the hunger that had swallowed his mind whole. Haru's throat under fingers that hadn't felt like his own. He tried to sit up. A hand on his chest stopped him, gentle but firm. Haru's face came into focus above him, exhaustion carved deep beneath her eyes, but relief unmistakable in them too. She told him he'd been out for almost a full day, that Jin had carried him half the distance back to a defensible ruin once the fighting died down. Piran's first question wasn't about the fight, or the predator, or how any of them had survived. It was whether he'd hurt her badly. Haru's hand drifted, briefly, to the bruises still darkening along her throat, then away again, like she didn't want him dwelling on them. She told him she'd live. She told him, more quietly, that he needed to understand something had happened to him back there that went beyond simple power, and that pretending otherwise wouldn't make it safer for anyone. Jin crouched nearby, tending a small fire with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. He didn't apologize for the deception in Zone 1, and Piran found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't need him to. The explosion, the freed cuffs, the ring of fire that had turned the Predator's own territory against her, all of it had cost Jin something too. His sister's death sat behind his eyes even now, a grief he carried without complaint and without release. A new voice interrupted before the silence could stretch further. A young man Piran didn't recognize picked his way carefully through the ruin's entrance, hands raised to show he carried no weapon, a battered radio slung across his back. He introduced himself as Hu Min, a runner working for the man behind the midnight broadcast. List had heard about the canyon, he explained, about the fall of the Predator's stronghold in the chaos that followed. He'd sent Hu Min to find survivors of the blast and bring word of something worth the risk they'd all just taken. List possessed a weapon, Hu Min said, something recovered from the wreckage of a research facility before the sky ever tore open. A device capable of destroying a monster's core instantly, without the years of specialized conditioning Piran's body had apparently required to manage the same feat by hand. Piran listened with the claw still resting heavy and wrong at the end of his arm, and thought that a weapon like that might matter to plenty of people. It didn't change what had happened to him. It didn't undo the hunger that lived somewhere under his skin now, waiting. Hu Min noticed the claw eventually, his expression flickering between fascination and unease, before he caught himself and looked away. He didn't ask about it directly. He simply told them List's base sat 2 days' travel further east, past the last of the looter territories, and that List was gathering anyone willing to fight for a chance at actually pushing the monsters back, instead of just surviving them one horde at a time. Piran asked for time before making that journey. Not much. Just enough to understand what had happened to him in that canyon, and how to keep it from happening again. Jin, surprising all of them, offered to help. His future sight, he explained, worked best on outcomes he could observe directly, which meant watching Piran push toward the edge of his control, again and again, until the pattern became visible enough to predict and, eventually, interrupt before it turned catastrophic. The training that followed was brutal, in a way that reminded Piran uncomfortably of the bunker, except this time the pain served a purpose he'd chosen for himself. Jin pushed him toward the threshold of the transformation deliberately, watching for the exact moment control began to slip, calling out warnings a half-second before Piran's own senses caught the change. Haru stayed close through all of it, her voice becoming the tether Jin's calculations couldn't provide. Whenever the claw began to spread, whenever the hunger started clawing its way back up through his thoughts, it was her presence, steady and unafraid, that pulled him back from the edge faster than anything else could. She told him once, during a rest between sessions, that she wasn't scared of the monster in him. She was scared of him disappearing inside it and never coming back out. That distinction seemed to matter to her more than anything else, and hearing it mattered to Piran more than he expected it to. Progress came slowly. The blue light he'd first summoned during the petrol fire began responding to intention rather than desperation, a controlled burn instead of an explosion he could barely survive. The claw itself never fully vanished, even at rest, though it grew easier to keep leashed, easier to prevent from spreading further than the single arm it had already claimed. 5 days into the training, a new threat found them before Piran felt anywhere close to ready. It came from the wreckage of a collapsed overpass, a creature covered in long, rigid spines that could launch outward like javelins, fast enough that even Piran's honed reflexes barely registered the first volley in time to react. Jin, caught in the open gathering supplies, took the worst of it, a spine grazing his side deep enough to drop him. Piran moved without thinking, the careful control he'd spent 5 days building giving way instantly to instinct. But this time, instinct didn't mean losing himself entirely. He felt the pull toward the hunger and, for the first time, chose the controlled burn instead. Blue light wrapping around his good arm as he closed the distance in a single burst of speed that left the ground cratered where he'd been standing. The punch that followed carried enough force to end the fight in a single strike, the creature's core shattering under an impact precise enough that nothing beyond it took damage. No transformation, no red haze swallowing his vision, just controlled, deliberate strength, wielded the way he'd always wanted to wield it. Jin, bleeding but alive, looked up at him with something that might have been the closest thing to respect the man had shown anyone since his sister's death. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Haru's relief, when she reached them moments later, expressed itself in a fierce, wordless embrace that told Piran everything her words usually didn't quite manage to say. That night, as the fire burned low and Jin's wound was bandaged as well as their limited supplies allowed, Piran allowed himself, for the first time since the canyon, to think seriously about what came next. List's weapon, the journey east. His mother, still out there somewhere, her existence confirmed by 4 scrawled words and nothing more. His father vanished into the chaos of that first collapsing bridge, leaving nothing behind but a lie about the end of the world and a truth about the woman he'd claimed was dead. He didn't know where any of those threads led, but for the first time since walking out of that bunker, he felt something close to ready to follow them. Miles away, far beyond the ruins of the Predator's fallen stronghold, a different group of survivors picked their way through a stretch of open highway, scavenging what little the wreckage still offered. They moved carefully, the way anyone still breathing this deep into the collapse had learned to move. Weapons ready, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for movement. One of them, crouching near an overturned truck, spotted something glinting faintly in the dirt. A pair of glasses, cracked but intact, chained to a thin cord like they'd been worn deliberately that way, secured against a wearer who couldn't afford to lose them in a fight. He picked them up, turning them over, something about the design tugging at a memory he couldn't quite place. He didn't get the chance to place it. A figure stepped out from behind the wreckage further down the highway, unhurried, sunlight catching against skin that hadn't seen daylight in longer than he cared to remember. Blue light crackled faintly along his fingertips, restrained but unmistakable. The same crackling energy Piran had first summoned in a burning alley weeks earlier, except honed now to a precision that spoke of decades rather than days. The scavengers raised their weapons on instinct. It didn't matter. The man crossed the distance between them faster than eyes could properly track, and within seconds, every one of them lay scattered across the broken asphalt, defeated without so much as drawing blood from the man who'd ended it. He didn't linger over the bodies. He simply retrieved the fallen glasses from where they'd dropped, turned them over once in his hand the way a man might examine an old photograph, and looked out toward the horizon where a distant column of smoke marked the last resting place of a canyon that had, days earlier, swallowed the Predator's stronghold whole. Somewhere out there, his son was alive. He'd felt the surge of that power days ago, distant and unmistakable, a signature only someone who'd spent years training the boy would recognize. The apocalypse he'd once promised Piran with lies had become real after all, but the man who'd built that lie hadn't vanished into the chaos the way everyone, including his own son, had assumed. He'd survived it. He'd been out here the entire time, moving through the ruins with a purpose no one left alive yet understood. He slipped the broken glasses into his pocket, turned his gaze toward the smoke on the horizon, and began walking. Whatever reunion waited at the end of that road, it wouldn't be the one Piran was hoping for.